People say power is like a vacuum, always desperate to be filled. My dad had only been in the ICU for 6 hours after a stroke, lying motionless with tubes and wires everywhere, and my husband was already rushing in to fill the empty space. 5 years ago, my father lifted him from a mediocre sales rep into a son-in-law because he saw potential. And me? I just saw a man who loved me like I hung the moon. We were both wrong. Now, while my dad fought for each breath, my husband stood in front of the mirror in the chairman's office, not to grieve, but to straighten his suit buttons and measure the curtains. His eyes held no tears, only a rabid hunger for power. The next morning, he called an emergency meeting. He planted himself in the chair at the head of the table, where my father's warmth still seemed to linger. Now he crowned himself acting CEO. And sitting right beside him was Mia, his personal assistant in a skirt that broke dress code and a flirty stare she didn't even try to hide. "The market is wobbling," he announced to the old guard executives, loud and decisive. "We need an iron fist. I'm restructuring the budget immediately." Uncle Henderson, our CFO and my father's right hand for 30 years, spoke up in protest. He reminded everyone that the research budget was the backbone of the corporation, untouchable. My husband just scoffed, leaning back with an arrogance I'd never seen from him before. He declared the old values outdated, and then, right there at the table, fired Henderson on the spot. I froze. Then I shot to my feet and objected, reminding him he had no authority to fire senior leadership without a vote. He turned to me, looking down at me the way you look at a child who doesn't understand grown-up business. "I have emergency authority," he said, his voice sweet, laced with poison. "Go reread the company bylaws, sweetheart. Actually, it's all dry technical language. You wouldn't understand it anyway. Go to the hospital and take care of Dad. Let the men handle business." Then he pressed a button, and the office glass turned opaque again, shutting me out of my own family's world. I chased Henderson into the lobby. Before security escorted him out like a criminal, he squeezed my hand and whispered urgently, "Emily, watch the accounts. He's siphoning assets. Check the consulting expense line, now." That night, my husband texted that he'd be late because he was entertaining important clients. I sat alone in my dark home office and opened my personal laptop. He'd already locked me out of the company server. A naive move. He'd forgotten that before I ever became the dutiful wife, I personally set up this corporation's network security 10 years ago. He thought I was just some rich girl who knew how to spend money. He didn't realize I had more than enough skill to be a senior auditor. I slipped past the firewall and pulled the financial logs. The numbers on the screen turned my blood cold. Massive sums had been drained under the label consulting fees and wired straight into a shell company registered in a tax haven. The authorization signature was my husband's. The cosigner was his assistant, Mia. I pulled his credit card statements to cross-check. Plane tickets to Paris, a Maldives resort, a diamond necklace. Every charge lined up perfectly with the dates he'd claimed were business trips. He hadn't just betrayed my trust, he was committing embezzlement. I stared at my reflection in the glass. I wasn't the naive wife anymore. I poured myself a stiff drink and knocked it back. He thought he'd locked me out of the executive suite. In reality, he'd just handed me the key to put him in prison. "Enjoy your throne while you can, sweetheart," I whispered into the dark. "It's actually an electric chair." The next morning, an urgent email hit every shareholder's inbox. The subject line was short and cold, like a death sentence. Notice of extraordinary general meeting. The meeting wasn't about business strategy. It had one agenda item: a vote to remove me from the board. The stated reason? I was mentally unstable, not clear-headed enough to make governance decisions. My husband moved faster than I expected. He wanted to yank out the last thorn in his side before my father could wake up. He wanted to turn my family's company into his personal playground, shared with his mistress. That night, he came home earlier than usual, carrying a big bouquet of lilies, the one flower I couldn't stand, because their heavy scent always reminded me of funerals. But of course he didn't remember. Or maybe he just never cared. He played the perfect husband so hard it was nauseating. "I'm only doing this because I want what's best for you," he said, sitting beside me and gently stroking my hair, his deep voice full of fake concern. "Everyone on the board can see you're exhausted. You should stay home, take care of your father, and go shopping. Relax a little. The business world is brutal, full of traps. Let the men carry that weight." He was manipulating me. He wanted me to believe I was weak, useless, that grief had driven me insane and I no longer mattered. He wanted me to step aside willingly so he could take everything legitimately, without looking like a thief. I clenched my hands under the blanket. I knew if I pushed back right now, if I acted strong or started arguing law, he'd get even more cautious. He'd find a dirtier way to take me down, or he'd move the money faster before I could stop him. I needed him careless. I needed him to believe he'd already won. So I gave him the performance he wanted most. I dropped my head, let my shoulders shake, and forced out a few hurt tears. My voice came out small and trembling. "Maybe. You're right. I'm so tired. I'm scared every time I walk into that boardroom. I don't understand any of the strategies you talk about. I just want Dad to wake up." Through my watery lashes, I caught the corner of his mouth twitch upward in a satisfied smile. Gone in a flash, but I saw it. He pulled me into his arms, soothing me the way you soothe a tame, obedient pet. "Good girl," he murmured in my ear. "Tomorrow in the meeting, you don't have to do anything. Just sit there. I've already secured enough votes. After this, I'll take you on a Europe trip to clear your head. Okay?" I nodded and pressed my face into his chest to hide the ice in my eyes. He was drunk on a victory that didn't exist. He thought I'd surrendered. He didn't know that a woman's tears aren't always weakness. Sometimes they're the perfect camouflage. He looked down on me because I was a woman who doesn't understand business. He was busy counting his supporters and forgot the most basic thing in the company bylaws, the one clause that would choke him tomorrow. The extraordinary shareholder meeting opened in air so tense it was hard to breathe. The large conference room was packed. Faces that had watched me grow up now avoided my eyes, staring at the table or their tablets. I understood. In business, loyalty is a luxury, and my husband had apparently paid enough to buy theirs outright. He stood at the podium with the confidence of a king about to be crowned. He rambled on about a new era for the corporation and the need to refresh leadership. Every word was a blade aimed at me, even though he never once said my name. He painted me as a fragile, emotional woman, dead weight holding the company back. "We need cool heads," he finished, his gaze sliding over me with theatrical pity. "For the stability of the corporation, I propose a vote to remove Ms. Emily Sterling from the board of directors." Mia moved from table to table collecting ballots, her triumphant smile completely unhidden. The outcome was exactly what I expected. The majority voted to kick me out of the company my father built. My husband looked at me and gave a small nod, like he was saying, "It's over. Go home." The room held its breath, waiting for me to fall apart, waiting for me to cry and run out like a pathetic loser. But I didn't cry. I stood slowly. I smoothed my blazer, lifted my chin. The weak, resigned wife from last night was gone. In her place stood the cold authority of someone with sterling blood. "Nice speech," I said, my voice clear and sharp, shattering the silence. "You planned it well. You bought off department heads. You manipulated the small shareholders. You thought with an overwhelming vote like that, you could throw me out." His smile tightened. "Emily, don't make this harder for everyone. The result is clear." "Yes, the result is very clear," I said, walking toward the head of the table where he stood. "But you made a fatal mistake, Jason. You were so busy cutting backroom deals with shareholders that you forgot the most important job of a CEO: reading the bylaws." I dropped a thick copy of the bylaws onto the table. The heavy thud made people jump. "Page 45, Section 3, I announced. "This corporation's ownership is split into two classes: common shares, the ones you're holding, and Class A shares, the class with ultimate voting power." I locked eyes with my husband, who was starting to waver. Under my father's living will and corporate law, 51% of the Class A shares belong permanently to the blood heir, me. And the special clause states clearly, those shares cannot be transferred to a spouse. The room erupted. Faces that had just turned their backs on me went pale. "That means," I emphasized, "even if every single one of you raises your hand against me, one shake of my head overrides it all. This isn't about how many people are in the room, it's about the weight of the vote." I planted my hands on the table and leaned in close as his face drained from red to ghost white. "You think you're the king?" I said. "You forgot this throne has the queen's name on it." Silence crushed the room. You could hear the HVAC humming. The people who'd just sided with my husband lowered their heads, afraid to even breathe. They understood the balance of power had flipped in a heartbeat. My husband stood frozen, sweat beading on his forehead. He tried to salvage the last scraps of dignity, stammering, "Emily, you misunderstood. That, that's an old document. We can revisit the share structure later. Right now, this meeting is to take out the trash." I cut him off, my voice flat as ice. I signaled the tech team. The projector screen behind him went dark, then lit up again, this time not with the fake growth charts he'd been bragging about. It displayed detailed bank statements I'd printed the night before. "Does this look familiar?" I asked, pointing at the screen. "J&M Global Solutions. Cute name. But what does J&M stand for? Jason and Mia?" Every head turned toward his assistant. Mia's face drained of color as she trembled against the wall. "For the last 6 months," I continued, circling the table like a predator, "my husband and this hard-working assistant have drained more than $3 million from the company under consulting fees. That money didn't build the business. It bought villas, diamonds, and fueled their little affair." Whispers swelled. The neutral shareholders stared at my husband with disgust. Grabbing power was one thing. Stealing shareholder money was unforgivable. "Jason," I said, my first time saying his name in days without a shred of marriage left in it. "As chair of the board, representing 51% of the voting shares, I hereby state, you are terminated effective immediately for embezzlement and severe ethical violations." "You can't do this to me," he screamed, lunging toward me, his face twisted, completely unhinged. "I'm your husband. I'm the one running this place." He didn't get the chance to touch me. The conference room doors flew open. 4 large security officers stepped in. I'd called them before the meeting began. "Escort the former CEO out of the building," I ordered, not even looking at him. "And Mia as well. Make sure they don't take a single company document. The only things they're allowed to leave with are personal items." 2 guards clamped onto my husband's arms. He thrashed, shouted, cursed. uselessly. The image of the polished, powerful man from earlier evaporated. What remained was a miserable failure being dragged toward the exit in front of the entire staff. When his yelling faded and then disappeared behind the elevator doors, I turned back to the people still in the room. Anyone else want to question my leadership? Not a single hand went up. Good, I said, sitting down in the chair at the head of the table, the one my husband had just occupied. Let's get to work. The divorce hearing ended faster than I expected. Jason walked into mediation looking wrecked, unkempt beard, hollow eyes, nothing like his usual polished self. But there was still one last spark of hope in him: the assets. He thought that even if he'd lost the CEO seat, marriage law would still let him claw out half of my family's enormous wealth. I want half the shares, or the cash equivalent, he demanded shamelessly through his lawyer, his voice rough. I gave 5 years of my youth to that family. I said nothing. I just gave a small smile and slid a thin folder across the table. The prenuptial agreement he'd signed 5 years earlier. Back then, he'd been drunk on love and so eager to join my world that he signed without reading. It spelled it out plainly. All shares and inherited assets were separate property, untouchable. My attorney delivered the killing blow. Mr. Jason, with the evidence of infidelity and corporate embezzlement our client holds, you will not receive a single cent. You're also facing potential prison time of 10 to 20 years. Ms. Emily has an offer. You sign, you walk away with nothing, and you repay what you stole. In exchange, she will not pursue criminal charges. Jason went paper white. His hand shook as he picked up the pen. He understood his life as he knew it was over. He signed, dropped the pen onto the table, and walked out carrying a massive debt and a dark future. I watched his back and felt strangely light. No rage left, only pity for a man ruined by greed. The first thing I did after I officially took the chairman's seat wasn't throw a celebration. I picked up my phone and called the one person the company needed most right then. "Uncle Henderson?" I said, my voice catching when I heard him answer. "Come home. Your desk is exactly the way you left it. The company needs you." 3 months later, my father woke up. A miracle. The first thing he did once he could sit up was ask for the quarterly financial report. When he saw the clean rising numbers, he looked at me, smiled with pride, and squeezed my hand. He knew he didn't have to worry anymore. The company hadn't collapsed. It had grown stronger than ever after cutting out the malignant tumor. This afternoon, I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the chairman's office and looked down at the busy city below. The red sunset washed over the skyscrapers. I studied my reflection in the glass. I wasn't that naive, fragile girl who loved blindly anymore. That betrayal forged me into steel. I learned the most expensive lesson in business. Trust is costly, and you don't hand it to someone who's bankrupt in character. My ex-husband thought he was the king. He believed he could control everything on this board. But he forgot the simplest truth. In chess, the queen is the strongest, freest, most dangerous piece, and the one that protects the empire. And in this game, I won.